Good morning again. Do we mean it as a nation when we make a promise to the rest of the world? Are Canadians sincere, or is it our new practice to make pledges and then deliberately renege like we did on the Kyoto commitments? That's the question that other nations are asking themselves about Canada's role in global environmental issue resolution. On biodiversity, we have another opportunity to reply to the arched eyebrows of the international community, and there's an important role for Ontario to play in that process. In 1993, the Government of Canada became the first industrialized country to sign the Convention on Biological Diversity, an international agreement to conserve biodiversity and commit to its sustainable use. By virtue of our Canadian Constitution, the Government of Ontario has a direct obligation to fulfill Canada's responsibilities under the Convention on Biological Diversity within its territory because the province manages the air, land, water, and ecosystems that support our wealth of biodiversity. In 1995, the Ontario government itself affirmed its commitment to biodiversity conservation along with all the other provinces and territories. In October of 2010, the world met again in Nagoya, Japan, to further objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Canada agreed, along with the other nations, to a series of strategic goals broken down into 20 specific objectives called the Aichi Biodiversity Targets. These targets recognize that preserving our biodiversity is not a simple task that requiring the attention of one or two government ministries. Rather, it requires changes in a wide variety of activities across many ministries. Success necessitates that those ministries become sensitive to their many influences on the ecosystems and that they change their way of doing business. In this report, I've attempted to clarify the challenges that face us by parsing the Aichi biodiversity targets and identifying which Ontario ministries would have to be engaged and responsible for the achievement of each target. I've done this because presently Ontario is ill-prepared to meet this challenge. The Ontario government no longer has a biodiversity strategy. There is a Biodiversity Council outside of government that is pursuing a broader strategy, but that group cannot assign the responsibilities of Aichi to government ministries. Canada cannot meet our Aichi biodiversity targets without Ontario's full commitment and engagement. Time is short. The Aichi commitments culminate in 2020. Canadians, and by extension Ontarians, made a commitment to the world on biodiversity at Nagoya. Are we prepared to follow through, or have we lost our dignity as a nation? I'll take questions.
The situation with the economy, are you concerned that that actually may make the government less likely to take on any new roles?
Well, I know we all know that the government has to make some tough decisions, economic decisions, expenditure decisions, but I think it's important to recognize that we do have these obligations and get them on the table first. And when we're making decisions about where we're spending money or not spending money, we have to acknowledge that these commitments have been made internationally. So we either renege or withdraw, or try to fulfill them as best we can. These particular commitments, I think, are achievable by existing ministries realigning within their existing spending, their priorities, and their programs. I don't see this as an expensive commitment to keep.
Why try to make this tangible for the average person out there? I'm not really sure I understand what happens if we don't meet these targets.
Well, I guess, what happens if we don't meet the targets in terms of biodiversity is we get increased problems and failures in our biodiversity. And the biodiversity underlays, it's the genetics, it's the species, it's the functioning of the ecosystems that underlie our entire economy, our agriculture, our forestry, our fisheries, and other components of our quality of life, our clean air, our clean water. So degradation of biodiversity is not just a problem here, it's a worldwide problem, hence the international agreement. But on another level of good government, or the need to have good government, what happens to our international credibility if further we sign these agreements and failure to follow through or even attempt to follow through? I don't think the world expects everyone to succeed, but I think they expect once you've signed these agreements to try. And that there's a whole question of international credibility that comes into play.
Are you saying that the provincial government is not even trying to meet these?
Right now, the way they're going, they're not in a position to address the Aichi targets. That's right. So if you like, you could say it's not trying. They're not trying. There is no government program. There was no strategy on biological diversity within the government that will realign the activities of these ministries.
Gord, I just wanted to go back at what Mike was asking in terms of This all sounds very bureaucratic, and I'm trying to see if there's a way we can lift it out of the bureaucratic and
Sure.
the process and stuff. Because when I say biodiversity to my editor, if I put that in a lead, I'm gonna not get too far getting the
That's
story
right.
in the paper.
So you want to talk about the fact that
Yeah, so can you put it on
Sure.
the ground, like with the...
we're already restructuring the Great Lakes. We've already lost fisheries. We've lost activity. We have, if the pollinators fail, we're in big trouble in certain agricultural crops that depend. We depend on wild pollinators to pollinate our fruit crops and our even our hay crops, even our alfalfa and such things. So we depend on the proper function of ecological systems. Our forest industry depends on the black spruce in northern Ontario. Climate change projections say that within 80 years the climate will be incompatible with growing spruce trees in northern Ontario. What happens to our forest industry then? These are the kind of problems facing with it. They're biodiversity problems. They're very practically oriented. We could lose sugar maple trees from southern Ontario. We could lose black spruce in northern Ontario. We already have a major crisis in our fisheries in the Great Lakes. These are real problems, practical problems that we will face in the way we live our lives day to day, notwithstanding the quality of life issues. That's the fact is that clean air and clean water and our quality of life, our recreation, all depends on a rich living biodiversity. We're losing our ash trees.
Could you go a bit deeper, just like kind of in the 25 words or less vein, into the spruce trees, the maple trees, and the fisheries?
That's a climate change primarily an issue. It's going to get too warm and too dry to support black spruce in the areas where it's growing right now. That's the climate change consequence. So what happens to a forest industry that's located depending on spruce trees in that zone? It's going to get our maple trees are under threat. We have an invasive species coming up through New York State. We have climate change acting on our maple trees. We're already losing our ash trees, like we lost our elm trees back in the 60s. We're losing, if we lose our maple trees, it's a very structure and fundamental of our forests. Is that the Ontario we want to live in? Or we want to be unprepared for that?
In the period of financial restraint that we have right now, the government is faced with two choices: save a tree or save a job. Which one do you think they're going to pick? They're going to save.
Well, that's the government's choice, isn't it? I mean, that's the government's choice. My job is to lay it on the table for the environment, and that's what I'm doing here. We have made an international commitment. Canada and Ontario have recognized that biodiversity is critically important to the economy. If it is, how does that factor into the decision-making that's going to be going on now and after Mr. Drummond makes his report? I mean, those are their decisions, but it's important, I think, to have these discussions and lay these obligations out and say, look, these are important things that have to be considered in the matrix. The government has to decide, there's no question. And they may make that other decision. That's their choice.
Is there any way you can convince them that saving a tree is as good as saving a job?
Well, I think when I mention things like pollinators, I think and the growth of critical trees that are the basis of industries, those are eye-opening points that make them reflect on the need to maybe contribute something to this effort. Again, I make the point, what this calls for and what the Aichi targets call for does not require huge expenditures. It requires basically a realignment. Let's take an example. The Ministry of Transportation has already done some really remarkable things within their mandate. 10 years ago, I would have said that it wouldn't be likely they would be the one. But today I sit here and say the Ministry of Transportation has done some marvelous initiatives on biodiversity, not their core mandate, but they saw the need to do it, and they've done it. And it didn't cost a lot of money, and it went within their regular business. It's more about aligning your regular business with some of these priorities rather than big new expenditures of big new priorities.
What has MTO done, and what kind of things like that do other ministries need to do?
MTO has been very forthright about protecting the lost of species crossing the roads. They've fenced out huge areas to keep in some of the key deer yards up near North Bay to reduce the slaughter of deer. There's safety aspects of that, no question. But they've also put underpasses on for rattlesnakes on Highway 69, and they're building a major overpass up near Sudbury for the reintroduced elk and other wolves and other species, so they can cross the new 4-lane highway, just like we have the only one east of the Rockies, because you've probably seen them if you've gone out west. Those kind of initiatives are already done, are already in play, notwithstanding this, which just came out in October 2010. So bold initiatives incorporated into the regular way of doing business. Doesn't have to cost a lot of money.
So what are some other things like that other ministries could be doing?
Well, and the Ministry of Natural Resources, I would see as the key lead to this sort of thing. The Ministry of Natural Resources, one of the Aichi targets call for setting aside of lands, protected lands. 17% of the landscape are protected lands. Well, we already have 12% of the area of the undertaking under the Living Legacy from years ago, with the Premier saying that 50% of the far north will be set aside and preserved and managed ecologically. In fact, Ontario, if they do that, exceeds that target right off the bat with things they've already done. So that's another initiative that's already in place. But it's a matter of recognizing this. To do that properly, they would have to do some enhancement of lands in southern Ontario, but that's, in terms of the major goal, they've virtually already achieved it.
Okay, is there anything else you see, like when you're driving around on vacation or on a Sunday drive or whatever, that you're driving down the road, that you notice that this is a problem that the government could do?
I think in agriculture, there's some big opportunities. And I think in agriculture, in terms of preserving the genetic material that is the basis of our food supply, we have work to do. But there are huge opportunities. In terms of managing the agricultural landscape, increasing soil carbon, managing the kind of crops and diversity of crops we grow, and to facilitate. We do some little areas, some little programs in some areas in Ontario, but we could do a lot more in terms of changing the way we do agriculture in support of biodiversity.
Commissioner, we've got the government threatening to cut 30% to certain ministries. I don't know, from what I saw in the election, the environment wasn't even on the agenda during the election campaign. So you got to think that natural resources and environment are going to be on the chopping block. How is that going to impact your warning here that we could lose maple trees, we could lose fisheries if the hatchet comes to the ministries?
Well, that's up to the government to decide. My job is to put these issues on the table.
The impacts.
Oh, the impact. Well, I've already said in my last report, the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Ministry of Environment are failing to meet their mandates because of lack of capacity. If the government chooses to substantially exacerbate that problem, then more programs will fail. We will not be prepared. We will get caught. We have biodiversity failures that have major economic and social consequences, and we will be unprepared to head them off or to do anything about them.
Can you define that so the average person can
Well, that's what I
understand
am
it?
giving examples over here. I mean, what if our pollinators fail? The bees are in trouble, right? What if our we're losing forest species now. We have invasives that are threatening to disrupt many forest species, including the sugar maple. We have we know about the Asian carp species that are raced to come into the Great Lakes, but we also know that already the Lake Erie is restructuring with the invasion of existing species, and fisheries are in trouble there. We have. It's not as if something is going to happen in the future. These are things that are happening right now. They're cutting all the ash trees out of north of Toronto here. I mean, this is the reality we're living in. If we want to just keep taking wave after wave of disruption without trying to respond, without trying to get out in front of it, without trying to do anything, that is our choice. It's not my choice, but it's a choice that can be made. You asked me what the consequence of the cuts. I don't know. They have to decide what they're going to cut and what they're not going to cut. But certainly when they cut, and when they're considering what priorities they're going to leave and what capacity they're going to leave in as government ministries, they have to take this into consideration, that the biodiversity is important. I don't just say it's important. They said, the government of Ontario said it's important.
Are we talking years or decades on the maple trees?
Maple trees, if the Asian longhorn beetle gets here within 5 or 6 years, they'll be in trouble within a decade. The climate change stuff will take. The impact of climate change will be a few decades away.
What specifically is threatening the Great Lakes?
The Great Lakes are, the major factor is the invasive species. There's been about 180 invasive species under the Great Lakes. The